Welcome to Islamic Decoration from 600 to 1400 in the Common Era. We're here in the Middle Ages now, looking at the rise of Islam as it comes sort of like a wedge between the Christian world, including the Byzantine and the Latin West, and the Persian Empire, which observes Zoroastrianism. So Islam explodes kind of out of the Arabian Peninsula in the late 6th century. And by the time of Muhammad's death in 632, we have this huge expansion. So the religion itself is on the spectrum with other Abrahamic religions, which can look back to the patriarch Abraham in the Old Testament, which include Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. These three religions have more in common than they do in difference. And so when we look at the Islamic art today, we should keep this in mind, that there are these two other traditions that appear and get looped into some of the Islamic art and architecture. When we say Islamic, we're talking about not only those who identify as Muslim, but a specific culture that includes Persian, North African, even Spanish, and Arabian, all of these different languages and cultures that are united by the Muslim faith or reverence to Islam. Islam itself means submission and was a religion that was promulgated by Muhammad, the prophet, out of this area in the Arabian Peninsula of Mecca and Medina. When he started to receive visions from the angel Gabriel in and around 610, Muhammad was out in the caravan routes, out in the desert, and he started to recite the particular revelations that he received. And these are what are recorded in the Quran, which is the holy text for Islam. The religion itself includes 5 pillars that support it. This is the profession of faith, namely that Allah is the only God and Muhammad is his prophet or his messenger. Prayer in the direction of Mecca multiple times a day, donation of alms or charity, fasting during periods of ritual such as Ramadan, and the Hajj, which, as we know from the other week, is the at least once in a lifetime trip to Mecca to circumambulate the Kaaba in the Great Mosque. So in this first map, we're seeing this very rapid expansion of the religion and the cultures associated with it and the cultures subsumed under it, as after Muhammad's death, the next couple of caliphs or leaders, deputies, take over this orange area, and then finally under the Umayyad dynasty, which is the first sort of territorial expansion, we see that the Islamic Empire is taking over all of North Africa, right? Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, etc., all the way to Morocco, and then up across the Straits of Gibraltar into Spain and conquering all of Spain after the year 711. Incidentally, also pushing up into France, about halfway through France, where they're rebuffed. But this area, although it's not included in your textbook, I think is one of the most important aspects of Islamic art and culture in the Middle Ages. Over time, the different dynasties and different caliphates start to break off from each other and to specialize and to go to bat against each other rather than a unified Islamic world versus Christian versus Persian. And so we have the development of various other caliphates that are encroaching increasingly on the Christian Byzantine East. Ultimately, the Seljuks take over all of Turkey, modern day Turkey. And then here we have a map that shows some of the crusading efforts that bring cross-cultural contact back to Western Europe from the Islamic world, et cetera, and then tapping into these kind of larger trade routes through Mongolian invasions. Okay, so Edward Said in 1978 introduces the term Orientalism. And when we stick the word ism onto the end of the word Oriental, which means East or Orient East, we're creating a sort of understanding of a system of thought that goes deeper than an individual person's awareness of believing those things. Orientalism is this concept that due to imperialism, due to racism, due to all of these other negative features of the Western academic world and the explorers and the invaders, et cetera, this sense that the West views itself as superior to the East, but on the other hand is sort of fascinated with and makes romantic or nostalgic Eastern art and architecture as part of this quote unquote civilizing mission. And you'll have watched the video from describing Edward Said's philosophy, how he's pushing back against this notion of Orientalism. And so today I want to kind of break down that East versus West divide and look at Islam as a unifying and creative factor in a number of different cultures and ethnicities and language groups, using a specific artistic and architectural vocabulary to unite people of different backgrounds. So we'll start here with the mosaics in the Great Mosque in Damascus. And at the period that this mosque was built, Damascus served as the capital to the Umayyad dynasty, which we just met. And this means that Damascus itself has tremendous power and wants to reflect the glories of the Umayyads. And so here in the Great Mosque, we see a couple of sets of mosaics, these exquisite greeny blue hues on gold backgrounds. And these mosaics are actually made of glass tiles, glass tesserae. And so a tessera can be made of ceramic, of clay, etc. But in the case of these glass ones, you can imagine how the play of candlelight would have acted on these cut surfaces, these faceted surfaces. And so what's interesting about this is, due to an anxiety about creating figures in Islamic art, as we already know, we also see this in Jewish art, these images do not have figures in them. They are aniconic. So if we think about what an icon is, it's this depiction of a holy figure that people can pray towards, that they can venerate, which created a lot of anxiety that people would be praying to an image, or people would think that the image was in some way representative of a divinity, etc. And so moving or restricting figures in Islamic art is something that's quite characteristic. So these aniconic images are full instead of architecture and foliage and vegetal and river scenes. And here on the left, we have these big billowy trees sort of swaying in the breeze. We have exquisite architecture with columns and domes. This little town even, no people, but still evidence of glorious constructions. And then this very placid river, and all around it, these geometric figures. So the fact that the mosaicist has used gold tesserae for the background collapses the image, right? Makes it seem somewhat two-dimensional, right? We don't have depth, like where there are fields and hills in the background, and we can kind of sense that we're closer to the buildings. Rather, everything is almost on the same plane. And the fact that it's gold and would be dancing in the candlelight indicates that the person creating this wanted to reflect a vision of paradise, of a heavenly space inside this holy mosque in the capital of the Umayyad dynasty. We also see our first example of appropriation and adjustment to pre-existing architectural and artistic styles. So here in these archways, we see another set, and also back here, another set of mosaics. So again, with the glass tesserae. But we see something distinctly familiar here. These are acanthus leaves. And acanthus leaves, as you remember, were the type of foliage that adorn the top of a Corinthian column in the Greek style. So what we're actually seeing here is a borrowing of a Mediterranean Hellenistic influence, but giving it a new kind of upgrade and a new stylistic twist inside this Islamic structure. And in addition to these acanthus leaves, the Great Mosque in Damascus has a few examples of what we call spolia. Spolia are items that are taken from other architectural or artistic contexts and put in a new context. So for example, in this particular building, the mosque is actually built up against the Roman temple that stood adjacent to its location, and actually uses that wall as one of its walls, right? So we're taking the building that belonged to a different religion and incorporating it now into the mosque. Inside this building, we also have a Greek theme that came from a Christian church. And so again, using somebody else's art and architecture in a new context, where now it's being given a new meaning in the Islamic scene. In terms of wall decorations, in addition to the mosaics that we just looked at, we have what we call these cute little stucco additions, very, very elegant and intertwined and sinewy and billowy, very curly-Q, heart shapes, circles, etc. All of this creating a very dynamic surface for the wall. Stucco is a thin plaster that can be applied and then carved or stamped. And so it's perfect because as it hardens, it retains the shape of whatever you've put in it. And you can see in both of these cases, in a private residence here in Iraq, so somebody would have been living with this daily, and then here in this grand palace at the Alhambra in southern Spain, which you'll be writing your discussion piece on this week, you can see that there's a repetition to the point where this could cover the whole wall, and it would serve as a sort of infinite wallpaper. In the Alhambra's piece here, we can see a combination of different floral elements, geometric, almost like pine cone shapes here, just every little inch detailed, but repetitive. Another traditional style associated with Islamic architecture, and I just realized that this shirt is very appropriate, is called ablaq. And ablaq architecture alternates dark and light colored stones. And what this does is it creates a dynamism, it creates visual interest inside the architecture. So here on the left at the madrasa, which is the school for Islamic learning, we can see the use of the ablaq in the sort of portal area, where first we have these curved bands, light and dark, interwoven with each other, sort of leading the eye in this serpentine fashion around the top of the portal. And then also, excuse me, imitating or borrowing almost this sort of square Greek key-like interweaving of right angles. And so this just gives it this elegant, decorative, sort of vibrating dark and light also here in the lintel. On the right, although it's 18th century, we have a sort of roadside inn in Damascus, and this is using the very same style of the ablaq. So I just introduced this much later example so that you can see that there's continuity in the vocabulary of Islamic architecture across centuries. And what this does is it enables the different styles to be used across all different kinds of media. So you might see this alternating black and white in a textile or in a piece of ceramic, as well as in these grander architectural structures. One of the most famous examples of the ablaq is the Great Mosque in Cordoba. And Cordoba is in Spain. And this is in the context of the Islamic Empire invading Spain and holding it for about 700 years, from 711 to 1492. And in Spain, which is why it's of so much interest to me, you're seeing a genuine blending of different religions and cultures manifest in the art and architecture in a melting pot sort of way that's quite different from the military invasions across North Africa, from what's going on in the Near East, et cetera. So that's why I wanted to incorporate it in the lecture today, in spite of the fact that your book doesn't really talk about it. So in Cordoba, the Great Mosque is a curious structure that really encompasses the theme of this lecture. The first thing that was built on this site before it was ever a mosque was a Roman temple to the god Janus. When the Visigoths came in after the fall of Rome, and this is a Germanic tribe that settles in Spain, they tore down the Roman pagan temple and built a little church, a little Christian church. And then ultimately, when the Muslims invaded, they replaced the church with this mosque. And then for some time, it went back and forth between hands. And so you can really see that manifest in the architecture. So as you remember from the mosques that we looked at, for example, in Jenne last week, you can see it's a very similar structure, largely speaking, right? We have the minaret, we have the outside courtyard with the portico all around it and the peristyles, all those columns. But then we have this larger center area around what is literally a Christian church. This is the classic cross-shaped floor plan that we see in medieval churches. We've got the external flying buttresses, which you guys will learn about, windows, stained glass windows, and the mosque is built around it. And underneath this is the hypostyle hall that you see here on the right. Remember, this means a hall that has multiple columns in it supporting the roof. So the hypostyle hall here is also this great example of the ablaq because it alternates the white stone with red brick. It's also an example of spolia because these columns and capitals are Roman, taken from a Roman structure in Spain, and incorporated and given new meaning and new context in this mosque, serving to hold up these double arches. And another element of Islamic architecture and art in general not only in the architectural sense, but like on any piece that qualifies, is the repetition of a form. So here in this case, you've got these horseshoe-shaped arches and then the double arch on top as far as you can see. So did you ever like hold two mirrors near each other and you just see yourself reflected back and back and back? It's the same kind of impact here. And what this does is it gives a sense of grandeur and a sense of enormity and power to this mosque, and therefore to the religion and the people who are here to serve. So in addition, the Great Mosque also gives us a gorgeous example of the mihrab wall. And the mihrab wall is a little prayer niche in here with a number of different architectural motifs around, which we'll discuss in one moment. But this would have been the prayer niche in what's called the Qibla wall. And the Qibla wall is the wall that is pointed towards Mecca. So any Muslim coming in to pray would know which direction to face during prayer. So another example of the Great Mosque of Cordoba taking a local tradition that is not Muslim and incorporating it into its architecture style is this horseshoe archway, which we just saw previous example of in the slide before. So what's interesting, obviously this is shaped like a horseshoe, but it's not fluid here, right? It doesn't just join its support underneath. It actually juts out on both sides and creates a kind of keyhole shape in the portal. So this is actually a Visigothic style. So these Germanic people who were living in what we call Spain before the Muslim invasion. And then we also have examples of Arabic text all around. And then again, gold and tesserae creating these beautiful mosaics. And above we have this dome, which has ribs that kind of jump from semicircular window to semicircular window, creating what we call pointed arches. And these will become later a hallmark of the Gothic tradition. We also have a little cupola or dome in the middle here that's recessed, and it has these golden beams kind of coming out, evoking the sense of heavenly wonder or splendor over this prayer niche. One of my favorite aspects of Islamic art and architecture is the use of the giri. So the giri tiles that you see here are specific shapes of tiles that can be arranged and used ad infinitum. You can make a consistently replicable image that can be pieced together to create really any sized surface. So here are 5 of the tiles that are typically used. And you can see in this case, it creates quite a small repetitive pattern. So each star and flower, right, kind of can be repeated. But then you can have increasingly expansive ones. So here we have patterns that are not just flower, 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 but the flowers are spread out, and we can see that there's a pentagon here, there's a triangle, and then this whole thing creates a star, as you can see here. So there's one pattern with another pattern inherent in it. So again, more complicated. And then finally, we have this example from the Alhambra, where we can see different types of patterns. And then ultimately, you'll know that this will be the center of a set of flowers over here, because just by this little glimpse, we can imagine it sort of folding out and folding out forever. So the important thing also about the giri, and sorry, I should explain, this is a type of decoration that is bound by ribbons, ribbon-like figures in these geometric shapes. So it's really the fact that these are not flush with each other, but that there's this turquoise ribbon in between to serve to delineate and to kind of create almost like a stained glass effect. This is a type of knotwork that originated, the word itself means knot in Persian, that originated in Syrian knotwork. So again, borrowing, but reincorporating and giving it its own technique. Also, even though this is 19th century, this is one of my favorite buildings, the Pink Mosque, do Google the stained glass windows, they are incredible. You can see that this is profoundly complicated. And so we know from studying the use of giri tiles that Islamic architects and artists were very, very proficient in math, and they were doing quite complicated mathematical projects to be able to create these devices and designs that would fit together forever. So in addition to something as large as showing up in, the dome of a mosque or on the wall, as we saw in the Alhambra, we also see the giri in smaller domestic objects. And what we have here is a plate or a sort of platter that is ceramic. It's called the Minai style, which is Persian for enamel. So what you see here is actually a multicolored glaze on the surface of the ceramic, which has been fired. And glaze can refer, on the one hand, to kind of like little nuance or detail and shadow that you're putting with one color superimposed on another, but it can also refer to the substance that you can harden on the surface of ceramic to give it that glisten or that sheen. Like if you have like a fancy bowl at home and it has like that extra kind of glassy surface to it. And because this has multiple layers of glaze, it was very expensive, right? Every time you apply the glaze, you have to refire it in the oven or the kiln. And so in addition to the images that are on it, this is really, inherently a symbol of status and wealth because it would have been quite expensive to produce. In terms of the images on it, we get a sense of what it should have been used for. The people depicted here are reflecting the people who would be using this bowl. So again, very elaborate robes, again, with this elegant, geary structure over here, and somewhat androgynous faces, only really distinct with facial hair on the male. But these are courtly people, so potentially inspired by Persian forms of romantic poetry, etc. And the male figure has his little harp, and the female figure has her little glass of wine, or like a little martini glass, it looks like to me. And they're engaged in some kind of elegant reclining and dining. And so the people that would have used this probably would have ferried it out during a banquet and shown off their wealth and status. But the important thing here is that there's this common vocabulary between even the very small art objects and the very enormous architectural objects that shows us this common language used by Islamic artists. One other characteristic of Islamic art is the use of Arabic script, calligraphy. And you'll have watched a video on calligraphy, so you'll know the whole history of it. But here we see a couple of examples of using Arabic in architectural and artistic objects more broadly, as though the script were art. So on the left here, we have this little brass bucket. And what's interesting about this, which is kind of perplexing to scholars, is that there are different layers of different types of script that we're seeing here. So it's a fairly small object. Was this meant to be used, or was this meant to showcase a workshop skill at producing different types of script? And you can see that the script itself is silver on the bronze background. And this is performed using the idea of inlay. So you're actually inserting other pieces of metal into the surface. And all around those pieces of metal, the artists who created this, whose names are in your book, are also employing the process of niello. And niello is a way of taking ground up minerals and metals, for example, copper, silver, I forget the other ones, doesn't matter. And they're ground up into powder and then pressed into the sort of etched out spaces on the surface of the bronze. And then that, sulfur is another one. And then that is actually fired so that those little crystals of mineral melt and create an enamel. So this hard surface made of these metals and minerals. On the right-hand side, we can see in the Alhambra, again, the use of gorgeous, almost like bird's feathers, Arabic carved directly over other foliate designs that kind of interweave with the language. Here we have these gorgeous curlicues behind, and then all around the traditional repetitive geometric shapes and geary knots that we've seen before. So again, using the language itself as an adornment. And all over the Alhambra, there's something like 10,000 examples of Arabic script in the art. And these range in inscriptions from "There is one God, Allah," "May Allah help us," verses from the Quran, prayers, etc. So this religious text is part of the structure itself. And down here in the so-called Friday Mosque in Isfahan, we can see that the use of the Arabic is really proliferated. It becomes the decoration, right? It's not on top of decoration like we see in the Alhambra, but actually the language itself becomes the decor. So this use of Arabic script and calligraphy as an artistic motif and not just communicative language is another hallmark of Islamic art and architecture. And this translates again across different media. So what you're seeing here are tiraz textiles. This is Persian for embroidery. And In both of these cases, you can see that there's gilded embroidery on top of woven textile. So here on the left, this is actually a piece of a turban done in this beautiful, beautiful, deep cerulean blue and literally embroidered over it with the needle, right? So you're not doing it on a loom or anything, but you're doing it by hand. We see Arabic text. And then here on this side, the process of dyeing this particular fabric, which has fringes, creates these alternating bands of sort of diamond-shaped features. And then on top of that, straight across, again, we've got beautiful, beautiful script that's been embroidered onto it. So the same motifs appear across different media. And in this case, on the left here, we have perhaps the oldest silk pile rug from the Islamic world. And again, you can see all the things we've seen before, the repetitive borders, the flowered shapes, the sort of curly-Q knotted like figures, stars, geometric shapes, etc. But used to a new effect here, right? This looks different even though it's using all of the same vocabulary. And then finally, this borrowing of the same elements, but given a slightly new updated 16th century look, right? This is very similar to some of the styles that we're seeing coming out of later British art, right? It's the same themes, but up to the artist's discretion. And so I think this is kind of the takeaway. All of the techniques and traditions that we've seen there's endless potential for creativity while staying in that same kind of paradigm where you have this common language and this common set of tools that Islamic scholars and artists and everybody, astronomers, everybody who's creating anything is really looping back into. And so there's space to incorporate external things like the horseshoe arch, like Roman spolia, while giving it a distinctly Islamic style and identity. And this is helpful because as the Islamic Empire is expanding and then breaking up, et cetera, and all of the regional differences in chapter 33, as you'll read about, are seeping in, there's an ability to create this overarching umbrella Islamic identity in spite of the cultural changes that are happening on the ground level. And this is really important for creating a stable and coherent populace. So here are your vocabulary terms. Good luck on your quiz.